The classroom went silent when Malik solved the equation. No one else could. But instead of applause, his teacher ripped the proof from his hands and threw it in the trash. The class laughed, the whispers spread, and Malik's future was on the line. What they didn't know, his answer would shake the entire nation. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights filled the classroom, faint but constant, like a quiet reminder of the hours slipping away. It was fifth period physics at Westfield High, the kind of suburban Georgia school, where the banners on the wall boasted about state football championships, but never about science fairs. At the front of the room, chalk dust floated in the stale air as Mr. Whitfield stepped back from the blackboard, leaving behind an equation so dense with symbols and variables that it looked almost alien. "Class," he said with a deliberate pause, adjusting his glasses, as though the weight of his words deserved theatricality. "This is the problem no student in this district has solved in 20 years. A challenge once used in graduate programs. I don't expect anyone here to get it, but I thought you might enjoy a glimpse of the impossible." The chalkboard stretched nearly the length of the wall, and the equation sprawled across it like a puzzle with missing pieces. For a moment, silence filled the room, a silence heavy with intimidation. Then came the inevitable: giggles, whispers, rolling eyes. "Yeah, right," a boy in the back muttered. As if anyone here could do that. The students relaxed into the comfort of mockery, their relief palpable. If the problem was unsolvable, then no one had to look foolish trying. But in the second row, Malik Johnson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Unlike his classmates, he didn't see a foreign language scrawled across the board. He saw familiar patterns, fragments of logic he had encountered in the thick textbooks he devoured at night. His fingers tightened around the pencil in his hand. And then, without warning, his arm rose. A ripple of laughter broke across the room. Heads swiveled toward him, some smirking, some incredulous. Malik wasn't just any student. He was the only black kid in the advanced physics class, and to most of his peers, that was all they saw when they looked at him. "Of course," a girl whispered to her friend with a laugh. "He thinks he's Einstein now. Bet he just wants attention," another muttered. At the front of the room, Mr. Whitfield froze. His polite smile barely masked the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Yes, Malik?" he asked, his voice tinged with something between curiosity and condescension. Malik swallowed hard. His throat was dry, but his voice came out steady. "I think I can solve it." The laughter grew louder now, unchecked. A boy named Ethan Parker, Whitfield's favorite, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Man, sit down before you embarrass yourself." But Malik didn't sit down. He kept his gaze on the board, his pencil tapping against the desk. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to show off. He knew the risks, knew what failure would mean in this room. But something deeper pushed him forward. He couldn't explain it, except that all those nights reading physics texts, scribbling notes by lamplight, while his mother worked double shifts, had led him here. Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat. "You think you can solve this?" "Yes, sir," Malik said. The teacher hesitated, as if debating whether it was even worth letting him try. Around the room, students exchanged glances, their whispers laced with sarcasm. "Let's see this," someone muttered. "This should be good." Mr. Whitfield finally gestured to the board, chalk still resting in the tray. "Go ahead then, Mr. Johnson." Malik rose from his seat, heart pounding in his chest. Every step toward the front of the classroom felt heavier than the last, as if invisible eyes pressed down on him, daring him to stumble. He could hear the laughter still, soft but sharp, like knives disguised as whispers. He reached for the chalk, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. When he faced the board, the noise behind him faded. All he saw were the symbols, the fragments of logic, the structure hidden beneath the chaos. His mind began to move faster than his hand. He wrote the first line, then another, slowly, carefully, each step leading to the next. The room fell quieter now. The laughter dimmed. Whispers gave way to silence. For the first time, Malik felt the shift. Some students leaned forward, their smirks replaced by curiosity. Line after line filled the board, Malik's handwriting sharp and precise. It wasn't blind guessing. It wasn't fumbling. It was control. Ethan sat up straighter, frowning. "Wait," someone whispered. "Is he actually getting it?" Mr. Whitfield's polite smile faded. He stood rigid at his desk, arms crossed, eyes locked on the board. He looked less like a teacher guiding a student, and more like a guard watching an intruder trespass. Malik's chest tightened, but he kept writing. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times alone, unseen. Every stroke of chalk echoed his defiance against every whispered slur, every sideways glance, every quiet dismissal. Then, just as he reached the heart of the equation, just as the shape of the solution began to emerge, Mr. Whitfield spoke. "That's enough." The words cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. Malik froze, chalk hovering just inches from the board. The unfinished symbols stared back at him. An incomplete melody interrupted mid-note. The class erupted in murmurs, confusion rippling through the room. Some looked relieved, others frustrated. But Malik turned, his voice uncertain. "I wasn't finished." Mr. Whitfield adjusted his glasses again, his tone measured but firm. "Before you go any further, Malik, let me ask you something. Do you even understand the basics of this equation?" The room erupted again, this time not in laughter but in a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. Students leaned forward, waiting to see Malik falter. Ethan grinned, whispering something that sent another wave of snickers across the rows. Malik's stomach tightened. The chalk slipped slightly in his hand, leaving a faint dust on his fingers. He looked from the half-finished equation on the board to the teacher's expectant face. The silence grew heavy again. And in that moment, standing in front of his classmates with unfinished brilliance on display, and doubt pressing in from every direction, Malik realized he wasn't just solving for physics anymore. He was solving for something larger, for his right to belong in this room. But Mr. Whitfield wasn't finished. His voice dropped lower, colder. "Tell me," he said, "before you embarrass yourself any further, do you even know what you're doing?" Malik stands frozen, the weight of the unfinished solution before him, and the teacher's doubt hanging in the air. His next words will determine whether the class sees him as a fraud or a genius. The air in the Johnson household always carried a quiet tension, like the hum of an old refrigerator that never quite turned off. Their home sat on the edge of Atlanta, in a neighborhood where the sidewalks cracked from neglect and porch lights flickered out because families couldn't afford to replace bulbs as quickly as they burned. The houses stood close together, weathered by years of storms and years of waiting for promises of city repairs that never came. Inside, the modest living room doubled as a study hall for Malik. Piles of borrowed library books lined the coffee table. Physics, calculus, engineering texts stacked in precarious towers. The spines were cracked and faded, evidence of how many hands had searched through them before his. Malik often ran his fingers along the pages as though they were maps leading him out of the world he knew and into one he was desperate to claim. Angela Johnson, his mother, would watch him from the kitchen doorway. Her nurse's scrubs still clung to her shoulders, the fabric wrinkled and dotted with faint stains from a double shift at the county hospital. Her eyes always carried exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue was pride. She never said it in long speeches. She rarely had the energy, but in the way she laid his plate of reheated dinner next to his books, in the way she touched his shoulder lightly before retreating to bed. Her message was clear. "Keep going, son. You're meant for more." Malik's father, Marcus, was a different presence in the house. Once a warehouse supervisor, he had been let go during a wave of layoffs 2 years earlier. The job had been replaced by endless gig work, rideshare apps that kept him driving late nights and early mornings, just to scrape together rent and bills. Malik remembered a time when his father carried himself with quiet authority, when the neighborhood men came to him for advice. Now, he walked with shoulders slightly hunched, as though he was bracing against blows no one could see. Despite the weariness around him, Malik's nights belonged to physics. He hunched over his notebook, sketching diagrams, scrawling equations, filling margins with notes and arrows. The silence outside his window was occasionally broken by sirens, or the rumble of a passing train, but Malik barely noticed. Each page he turned, each formula he unraveled, felt like a step closer to MIT, a dream he whispered to himself when the house was asleep. But dreams in Malik's world never floated without weight. At school, whispers chased him down hallways, labels glued to his back before he ever opened his mouth. The kid from the wrong side. The one who doesn't belong. Teachers praised Ethan Parker for average work while overlooking Malik's brilliance. Students mocked him with backhanded compliments. "You're smart for someone like you." The sting wasn't in the words alone, but in the way they were said with the certainty that his race and his neighborhood defined the limits of his future. One night long after Angela had gone to bed, and Marcus had pulled the car into the driveway from another late shift, Malik sat surrounded by open textbooks. His lamp cast a cone of light over the desk. The rest of the room swallowed in shadow. He was so absorbed in his notes he barely heard the front door open. Marcus stepped inside. His steps slow, his face tired from hours of smiling politely at strangers who climbed into the back of his car. He paused at the sight of Malik's desk, the chalky smell of old library books lingering in the air. "You're still at it?" Marcus asked, setting his keys down on the counter. Malik nodded without looking up. "I'm close to figuring out a method for that problem Whitfield put on the board today." Everyone thought it was impossible. Marcus sank into the worn armchair, rubbing his hands over his face. "You mean the one your teacher said nobody's solved in decades?" "Yeah." Malik's pencil moved quickly, tracing lines across the page. "But I see a path through it. If I can show the solution step by step, maybe—" Marcus cut him off with a weary sigh. His voice wasn't harsh but heavy, as though each word carried years of warning he didn't want to give. "Son, even if you're right, they won't want to hear it." Malik froze, pencil hovering above the page. The words hit harder than he expected, harder than anything whispered in the hallways at school. He finally looked up at his father, confusion and defiance warring in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Malik asked quietly. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The shadows carved his face into sharp lines. "I mean, you can show them brilliance, and they'll still say you cheated. You can prove them wrong, and they'll still find a way to tell you you don't belong. I've seen it too many times, Malik. It's not about the answer, it's about who gives it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Malik wanted to argue, to insist that logic and proof could outweigh prejudice. But deep down he knew his father wasn't speaking from cynicism alone. He was speaking from scars. Scars formed from interviews where Marcus was told he wasn't the right fit. From promotions that never came. From jobs where his ideas were credited to someone else. Malik lowered his pencil. The glow of the lamp suddenly felt harsh. The pages of his textbook glaring back at him with an unspoken question. What if he's right? But beneath the weight of his father's warning, something inside Malik pushed back. He thought of his mother's quiet sacrifices, of her hands rough from work, of her exhaustion hidden behind soft encouragement. He thought of the way Whitfield had stopped him in class, as though brilliance from him was a threat instead of an achievement. And most of all, he thought of the unsolved equation, staring back at him like a door, locked but waiting. "I still have to try," Malik whispered, almost to himself. Marcus exhaled deeply, looking at his son with a mix of pride and worry. He didn't respond right away. The ticking of the old clock on the wall filled the space between them. Finally, Marcus stood, his shadow stretching across the room. "Just be ready, Malik. Because when they see you solve it, some people won't clap. They'll look for a way to tear you down." He turned and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, leaving Malik alone with his books, his lamp, and the echo of words he couldn't shake. Malik stared at the unfinished work on his desk. His pencil hovered again, his mind racing between two truths, the brilliance he knew he carried, and the resistance he would face for daring to show it. And in that fragile moment between determination and doubt, Malik realized his father's warning wasn't just about physics. It was about the world waiting outside his door. Malik sits frozen at his desk, hearing his father's warning replay in his mind. "Even if you're right, they won't want to hear it." As the light flickers above him, leaving him unsure if his fight for recognition will end in triumph or destruction. Malik carried his father's words with him the next morning like a stone in his chest. "Even if you're right, they won't want to hear it." They echoed in his mind as he walked the cracked pavement, leading into Westfield High, the cold January air biting against his skin. He clutched his worn notebook tighter than usual, the pages inside filled with line after line of equations he'd worked through until dawn. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, but his resolve was sharper than it had ever been. The hallway chatter didn't help. Whispers rippled as he passed, subtle enough to seem harmless but barbed with intent. "Think he solved it overnight?" One voice muttered, mocking. "Nah, he probably Googled it," another replied. "Kid doesn't even belong in AP Physics. Who's he trying to fool?" Malik kept walking. He had trained himself not to flinch, but every word lodged itself inside him, like a splinter. He found his seat in the second row, laying his notebook flat on the desk as though the simple act of being ready could shield him from their doubts. When Mr. Whitfield entered, the classroom shifted into silence. The teacher placed a fresh piece of chalk on the tray and glanced at the board where the daunting equations still loomed, untouched since the day before. He straightened his tie and turned to the class. Yesterday was interesting, Whitfield began, his voice smooth but sharp at the edges. We saw enthusiasm. But today, let's move forward with actual productive work. The implication was clear. Malik's attempt hadn't been productive. It had been a disruption. Malik felt heat rise in his chest. He knew the steps he had written yesterday were correct. He also knew Whitfield had cut him off. Not because he was wrong, but because he was too close to being right. A hand shot up from the back. Ethan Parker, with his clean polo shirt and self-assured grin. Mr. Whitfield, shouldn't we review the problem again? You know, just so we all see why it can't be solved. The class chuckled softly, all eyes turning to Malik. Ethan didn't have to name him directly. The target was obvious. Whitfield nodded. Good suggestion, Ethan. Let's examine the problem again. He tapped the chalk against the equation, explaining each line with rehearsed precision. His tone carried authority, as though repetition alone made the impossibility unquestionable. But as Malik followed along, something struck him like a jolt. One of the coefficients had been copied incorrectly, a subtle but critical error. Malik had noticed it last night while cross-referencing old texts, but here it was again, an oversight that made the problem appear far more unsolvable than it actually was. His pulse quickened. Should he say something? His father's warning rattled inside him. They won't want to hear it. Yet he raised his hand anyway. Yes, Malik, Whitfield asked, the polite smile returning. There's a mistake, Malik said carefully. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the quiet classroom. The coefficient on the third term. It should be negative, not positive. That's why the equation looks unsolvable. A hush fell. Head swiveled. Ethan snorted. Seriously? He's calling the teacher wrong now? Whitfield stiffened. His eyes flickered to the board, then back to Malik. This equation has been used for decades. I assure you, it's written correctly. But Malik didn't retreat. He opened his notebook, flipping to a page filled with neat calculations. I checked it against multiple sources last night. If you carry the positive forward, the variables collapse incorrectly. But with the negative, the structure balances. That's why the solution pathway opens up. He held up his notebook. The logic laid bare. For a moment, the room was silent. Even the students who normally tuned out seemed caught. They weren't used to seeing someone press a teacher so directly, especially not Malik. Then came the whispers. Sharp and cutting. He must have copied that. Probably found some solution online. No way he figured that out himself. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He walked toward Malik, plucked the notebook from his hands, and glanced at the scrawled pages. His eyes flicked over the steps, recognition flickering for the briefest moment before he snapped the notebook shut. Even if your correction were valid, Whitfield said, his tone clipped, you still wouldn't get very far. These equations require advanced methods far beyond your level. Malik's chest burned, but he stood. I can show the steps. Just let me write them out. The class erupted with mixed reactions. Some laughed, others groaned, but a few leaned forward, curiosity tugging at their skepticism. Malik walked to the board again, his father's warning echoing louder than ever in his head. He picked up the chalk and began where he left off. Each line came steadily, confidently, the rhythm of someone who had spent endless nights rehearsing in solitude. Symbols filled the board, logic unfolding like a map. For every step that proved consistent, the air in the room grew heavier. Ethan leaned toward a classmate and whispered, he's just copying. No way he understands this. But the classmate didn't laugh. He kept watching, eyes narrowing. Malik's work wasn't random. It flowed. The more correct he seemed, the angrier the atmosphere grew. The laughter turned brittle, edged with unease. Because what if he really was right? What if the kid they dismissed as an outsider had seen something they couldn't? Whitfield's face darkened, his crossed arms pressed tighter against his chest. His authority was unraveling, and with every equation Malik completed, the balance of the classroom tilted. Malik wrote another line, then another. The problem that had sat like a monolith on the board for days was breaking open, step by deliberate step. The silence was electric now, every eye fixed on the chalk, every sound amplified, the scrape of the chalk, the faint creak of shoes shifting on the floor. And just as Malik reached the final stages, just as the equation was on the verge of resolution, Whitfield's voice cut through the air like a blade. That's enough. The chalk froze mid-stroke. Malik turned slowly, the unfinished solution glowing behind him. Whitfield's eyes were hard, his arms folded tight. "You've gone far enough." The words hung heavy in the room, smothering the tension but not releasing it. For Malik, the cliff between triumph and humiliation yawned wide. Malik stands before the nearly completed solution, the teacher's authority pressing down like a gavel. His next move will determine whether the truth is silenced or exposed. The chalk hovered in Malik's hand, his unfinished solution blazing across the blackboard like a rebellion in white strokes. The classroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. He could feel every eye on him, some sharp with doubt, others narrowing with disbelief. He had almost reached the end. Almost. But Mr. Whitfield's words cut the moment in half. "You've gone far enough." The silence cracked. A ripple of laughter moved through the class, small at first, then swelling as if the students needed permission to let it out. Malik's chest burned, but he forced himself to stay still, the chalk still warm in his fingers. Whitfield stepped forward, his hands clasped behind his back. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Malik, I admire your confidence. But let's be honest with ourselves. This solution isn't yours." Malik's head jerked slightly. "Excuse me?" Whitfield's tone sharpened, though his smile remained fixed. "It's obvious you must have found this online, copied it from somewhere. Students have tried that before, passing off someone else's work as their own." A murmur rolled through the classroom. The sting wasn't in Whitfield's words alone. It was in the way they fit so neatly into the students' assumptions. "He probably Googled it," someone whispered. "Yeah, no way he came up with that himself. Got lucky with a guess, maybe." The whispers grew, feeding on each other until the room felt like it was tilting against him. Malik turned back toward the board, his unfinished steps staring back like evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. "There isn't a solution online," Malik said, his voice steady but trembling beneath. "I worked through this myself. I can explain every step." Ethan Parker, lounging in the back row with his arms crossed, let out a loud, exaggerated laugh. "Sure, Malik. And I'm about to win the Nobel Prize. You should stick to basketball, man. Leave physics to people who actually get it." The class erupted in laughter, louder this time, the kind that stabbed rather than stung. Malik's grip tightened on the chalk. He didn't play basketball. He had never even tried out for the team. But that didn't matter. The stereotype was enough. Mr. Whitfield didn't correct Ethan. He didn't shut down the laughter. He simply let it play out, his silence speaking louder than any defense could have. When it finally died down, he turned back to Malik, with a look of practiced patience. "If you truly believe you understand this," Whitfield said, "then prove it. Step by step. On paper." Malik's heart pounded. This was his chance, but he could feel the trap in it, the unspoken assumption that if he faltered once, even slightly, it would confirm their suspicions. Still, he nodded, walked back to his desk, and pulled out his notebook. The classroom buzzed with low chatter as Malik bent over the page, his pencil moving furiously. His handwriting filled the lines with precision, each symbol connected, each arrow deliberate. He blocked out the whispers, the snickers, the sideways glances. The only sound he let in was the scratch of graphite across paper. Minutes dragged, and slowly the chatter dimmed. One by one, students began to glance over, curiosity overtaking mockery. Even Ethan leaned forward, watching Malik's pencil carve order out of chaos. Finally, Malik placed his pencil down. His hand ached, but the proof was there. Line after line, page after page, a complete pathway to the solution. He rose, clutching the notebook tightly, and walked it up to Whitfield's desk. "Here," Malik said quietly. "Every step. My reasoning. It's all there." Whitfield didn't take it immediately. He looked at Malik first, his eyes searching, as though waiting for a crack in his resolve. When Malik didn't flinch, Whitfield finally accepted the notebook. For a moment, the teacher flipped through the pages. His expression didn't change, but Malik saw it, the flicker of recognition, the split-second acknowledgement that the work was sound, that it made sense. But instead of praise, instead of even neutral acknowledgement, Whitfield's lips pressed into a thin line. He closed the notebook, held it for a breath too long, and then with a swift motion, crumpled the front page in his hand and tossed it into the trash can beside the desk. The sound of paper hitting metal echoed through the room. Gasps and laughter erupted again, louder than before. Ethan slapped his desk, laughing so hard he doubled over. "Man, I told you, all that work. And for what? Trash is exactly where it belongs." Malik stood frozen, heat flooding his face. His proof, his hours of work, his chance at being seen, lay balled up in a trash can, dismissed in front of everyone. Whitfield adjusted his glasses, his tone still calm, still patronizing. Class, let's remember that enthusiasm doesn't equal accuracy. Malik, I'd encourage you to focus on achievable goals rather than chasing after problems beyond your capacity. The words cut deeper than the laughter. Achievable goals. Beyond your capacity. Malik's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to let his head drop. He met Whitfield's gaze, forcing himself to hold steady. I can prove it again, he said firmly. I don't need that notebook. I can redo the entire proof right now, in front of everyone. The class fell silent again, the challenge hanging heavy in the air. For a split second, Whitfield's mask slipped. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't threatened by Malik's mistake. He was threatened by Malik's success. Sit down, Whitfield said, his voice sharper now. But Malik didn't move. You said to prove it. Let me prove it. The silence stretched, tension thickening, until it was suffocating. The class watched, torn between wanting the show to continue and wanting to see Malik shut down again. Whitfield finally stepped closer, his shadow falling across Malik. His voice dropped low, cold enough for only Malik to hear. Enough. You don't get to challenge me in my classroom. And with that he picked up the crumpled proof from the trash, held it for a moment as though considering, and then pressed it deeper into the can, burying it beneath other papers. The message was clear, not just discarded, but erased. Malik's heart pounded as he returned to his seat, his proof buried in a trash can, yet inside him the fire to be heard only grew stronger, promising that this humiliation was not the end, but the beginning of a much larger fight. The bell rang, its shrill tones scattering students into the hallway like a wave breaking against rocks. Malik lingered at his desk longer than usual, his eyes darting once toward the trash can where his proof still lay buried. The laughter had died down, but the sting of it clung to the air. He finally gathered his books, straightened his shoulders, and stepped into the corridor. But the hallway was waiting for him. It began with smirks. Students passing by shot him glances laced with something between pity and ridicule. Then came the words, tossed like stones into the crowded current of voices. Yo, that's the kid who tried to one-up Whitfield. Didn't he, fake some big solution? Yeah, got shut down hard. Dude shoulda just kept quiet. Each phrase followed him, sticking to his back like wet clothes. Malik walked faster, gripping his books tighter. He wanted to disappear into the blur of lockers and footsteps, but the whispers found him no matter where he turned. By the time he reached the cafeteria, the story had already twisted into something new. He wasn't the student who tried to solve the impossible equation. He was the arrogant kid who thought he was smarter than everyone else, who had stolen work and been exposed. Crazy how he thought he could just copy something off the internet and no one would notice. One student said loudly at a lunch table. Exactly, another replied. Whitfield put him in his place. Malik froze at the doorway, his tray trembling in his hands. His stomach churned. It wasn't just ridicule. It was a verdict passed without trial. His character rewritten in the span of a day. He took a seat in the corner, away from the buzz of voices. For a moment he stared down at his food, unable to eat. He could still hear Ethan's voice, echoing from earlier. Stick to basketball. That line had traveled fastest of all, repeated and reshaped into memes, scrawled on notebooks and whispered with laughter in the halls. And the teachers weren't immune. In chemistry the next period, Ms. Harrell glanced at Malik with a raised brow before starting the lecture. Let's keep today's discussion on track, she said, though no one had spoken out of turn. The implication landed squarely on him. In English, Mr. Crowley smirked as he called attendance. Glad to see you back with us, Mr. Johnson. Hope today's lesson isn't beneath your genius. A few students chuckled, and Crowley continued without pause. Each subtle remark was sharper than the last. Malik felt his world shrinking. Classrooms no longer safe spaces for learning. Hallways, no longer neutral ground. Even the teachers, the adults, who were supposed to protect fairness, seemed complicit in reshaping him into a cautionary tale. By the end of the day, Malik's notebook felt heavier than his backpack. He sat on the edge of his bed that night, the pages open, the symbols staring back at him like unspoken truths. He knew what he had done was correct. But correctness didn't matter when the story told about him drowned it out. Angela noticed the quiet at dinner. She set down her fork and studied him across the table, Rough day. Malik hesitated before nodding. They think I cheated. Everyone. Even the teachers. Angela's jaw tightened. She reached across the table, laying a hand on his. You know the truth. That's what matters. Malik shook his head. Not if no one else believes it. The weight in his voice broke something in Angela's eyes. But she didn't let it show. Malik, you don't stop shining just because others refuse to see the light. Her words steadied him. If only briefly. But the next morning, as he walked into school, he realized the whispers hadn't died. They'd multiplied. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and now they carried his name like a banner. He embarrassed himself and Whitfield at the same time. Arrogant. That's what my brother said. Arrogant. Guess they thought he was the next Einstein. Guess not. By lunchtime, Malik felt the isolation solidify. Students didn't sit near him. Conversations stopped when he passed. He was no longer invisible. He was defined. Defined by a narrative written by others. A narrative that erased his brilliance and painted him as a fraud. And then, the unexpected twist. As Malik sat in the library during study hall, trying to focus on his work, the door opened and Whitfield himself walked in. His tall frame filled the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Malik. Johnson, he called. His tone was flat, devoid of warmth. Come with me. The library fell silent, all eyes turning toward Malik. He stood slowly, closing his notebook with trembling hands. The whispers had painted him as arrogant, but this being summoned by Whitfield in front of everyone felt like confirmation of their worst assumptions. Whitfield didn't speak as they walked down the corridor. His footsteps echoed off the tile, his arms clasped behind his back in deliberate authority. Malik's chest tightened with every step. Finally, Whitfield stopped outside the principal's office. He knocked once and opened the door. Mr. Johnson, the principal said, looking up from behind a polished wooden desk. Come in. Malik stepped inside. The blinds were half drawn, the office dim, the air heavy with the faint smell of coffee. He sat in the chair across from the desk, his palms sweating against his notebook. The principal folded his hands. His expression was carefully neutral, but his words carried weight. We've received concerns about your behavior in class, disrupting lessons, creating unnecessary conflict. Malik's heart dropped. Conflict? He had solved a problem. He had defended his work. But here, in the principal's office, the narrative was already rewritten into discipline. Malik stares at the principal in shock, realizing that instead of recognition, he is about to be punished for daring to be brilliant. The principal's words still rang in Malik's ears, long after he left the office. Disrupting lessons, creating unnecessary conflict. It wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict. He'd sat there stunned, as his protest that he had only been proving his solution was brushed aside with a tight smile and a dismissive nod. When he returned to class, the whispers doubled. Students didn't need details. The sight of Malik being called into the office was enough to cement the narrative. He had crossed the line. By the time school ended, his shoulders felt like they carried bricks. He walked home slower than usual. His notebook pressed against his chest, as if holding it tightly could shield him from the weight of shame. Angela noticed it the second he stepped through the door. She was already in her scrubs, readying herself for another double shift, but she paused mid-motion as soon as she saw his face. Malik? What happened? He hesitated, dropping his backpack onto the floor. They called me into the principal's office. Angela's brow furrowed. She crossed the room quickly, cupping his chin so his downcast eyes met hers. Why? Because I proved Whitfield wrong, Malik said, his voice breaking at the edges. And now they're saying I'm disruptive. Angela's chest rose sharply. She knew this pattern. She had seen it before, not in equations, but in her own world of work. Black nurses overlooked for promotions, accused of being difficult when they spoke up, praised only when they stayed quiet. The anger surged hot in her blood. You wait right here, she said, her voice low and steady. I'm going to that school. Mom? Malik started, but Angela was already untying her apron, her hands shaking with restrained fury. Within 20 minutes, Angela stormed into Westfield High, her sneakers pounding against the polished floor. The receptionist barely had time to speak before Angela pushed past, her voice slicing through the air. Where's Principal Harris? She demanded. Moments later, Angela stood in the office, her arms crossed tightly, as Principal Harris rose from his desk. His expression was composed, almost rehearsed. Mrs. Johnson, I didn't expect you. You should have, Angela snapped. You called my son in here to accuse him of causing conflict, when all he did was solve a problem your teacher couldn't admit he was wrong about. Harris raised his palms in a mock gesture of calm. Mrs. Johnson, I assure you this isn't about race. Malik is a bright young man, but he needs to respect classroom authority. Undermining a teacher. Undermining? Angela cut him off, her voice rising. Do you know how many nights my son stays up studying? Do you know he walks to the library when the buses stop running, because he refuses to let our neighborhood define his limits? And when he proves himself, your teacher throws his work in the trash, and you call him the problem? Harris's eyes flickered with something discomfort, maybe even guilt, but his words stayed measured. Mrs. Johnson, I understand your perspective, but rules exist for a reason. Malik's behavior has been interpreted as confrontational. If he wants to succeed, he needs to learn humility. Angela leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. Humility? You mean silence? You mean knowing his place? Isn't that right? The office went quiet. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to pause. Harris's jaw tightened. But he didn't answer. He didn't have to. Angela's eyes blazed. You don't get to bury my son's brilliance because it makes you uncomfortable. You don't get to rewrite his story into arrogance just because he dared to shine. You'll remember his name one day, Principal Harris. And when you do, you'll wish you had supported him instead of trying to break him. The words hung in the air like a verdict of their own. Harris shifted in his chair, his authority suddenly smaller under her gaze. But instead of conceding, he cleared his throat and reached for a folder. Mrs. Johnson, please understand. We want Malik to succeed, but there are ways of doing so without causing disruption. I suggest you encourage him to channel his energy into more appropriate outlets. Angela straightened, her disgust unmasked. She turned on her heel and left the office without another word, her sneakers echoing down the hall. When she got home that evening, Malik was at his desk again, bent over his books. Angela walked in quietly, her anger still burning but softened by the sight of him working despite it all. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You keep going, baby. Don't you let them scare you into silence. I stood up for you today, but tomorrow you stand up for yourself. Malik nodded, though a shadow still lingered in his eyes. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe his work would matter, that proof would eventually outweigh prejudice. But the memory of Whitfield tossing his notebook into the trash gnawed at him. That night, when the house finally fell quiet, Malik sat in the glow of his desk lamp, scrolling through his school email on the battered old laptop his uncle had given him. A new message blinked at the top of his inbox. At first he thought it might be from a teacher, maybe even an assignment notice, but when he clicked it open, the subject line froze him cold. Stay in your place. No sender name, no signature, just 3 words, stark against the white background of the screen. Malik's breath caught. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, but he didn't type. He couldn't. His chest tightened, his father's warning suddenly echoing louder than ever. Even if you're right, they won't want to hear it. Now it wasn't just whispers in hallways, or laughter in classrooms. Someone had gone out of their way to remind him, in writing, that brilliance wasn't enough to protect him. Malik stares at the glowing screen, the anonymous warning burning into his mind. Proof that the fight was no longer just inside the classroom, but creeping into the shadows of his life. The anonymous message haunted Malik through the night. Stay in your place. He stared at the glow of the laptop screen, long after the words had burned into his memory. Sleep barely came, and when it did it was shallow, broken by flashes of chalkboards, laughter and shadows whispering his name. The next morning at school, Malik noticed the shift immediately. Whispers were sharper now, not confined to hallways, but buzzing openly, like a swarm that had grown too large to contain. Students didn't just look at him, they smirked, nudged each other, laughed as he passed. It wasn't until lunch that he understood why. Ethan Parker's phone sat in the middle of his table, glowing with an image Malik recognized instantly. Himself at the chalkboard, caught mid-sentence, chalk in hand. Underneath a caption in bold letters, "When the janitor tries to solve physics." The table erupted with laughter. Other students crowded around, pulling out their own phones. Within minutes, variations spread. Malik's face photoshopped onto a janitor's uniform, pushing a mop. Another image showed him holding a basketball instead of chalk, with the caption, "Stick to what you're good at." By the end of lunch, the memes weren't confined to Ethan's table. They were everywhere. Screens lit up across the cafeteria, laughter bouncing off the walls. Malik sat alone, his untouched tray in front of him. Every cruel image like a punch he couldn't block. That afternoon, more appeared online. An anonymous Instagram account popped up, posting video clips of him at the board, zooming in on his nervous hands, overlaying music meant to mock. Comments flooded in. Arrogant. Who told him he was smart? Dude looks like he cleans the classroom after hours. The screen was merciless. Every scroll, every refresh brought new cruelty. By the end of the day, Malik couldn't escape it. Not in class, not in the hallways, not even in the quiet of his room. His phone vibrated constantly with notifications, each one reminding him that his humiliation had gone viral within the school. Angela noticed the way he carried himself differently that evening. He didn't meet her eyes, didn't fill the silence with stories of what he was learning. Instead, he sat hunched at his desk, his phone screen glowing in the dim light. "What is it?" she asked softly, setting her bag down. Malik didn't answer. He just handed her the phone. Angela scrolled through the posts, her face tightening with each cruel caption. She set the phone down slowly, her jaw clenched. "They're trying to break you," she said, her voice steady but trembling with anger. Malik's eyes burned, though he refused to let the tears fall. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong there." Angela crossed the room in 3 strides, placing her hands firmly on his shoulders. "Don't you ever say that. Don't you ever believe that." Her voice was fierce now, shaking with conviction. "You think this is new? You think you're the first to be mocked for daring to step where they said you didn't belong? Baby, this fight is older than me, older than your grandparents. They laughed at the marchers. They mocked the sit-in. They said the same words. Stay in your place when all people wanted was equality. This isn't about you being wrong. It's about them being afraid you're right." Malik's throat tightened, but it doesn't stop them from laughing. Angela's gaze softened, though the fire in her eyes didn't dim. "Let them laugh. Every great name you read about, every scientist, every thinker, they were doubted, dismissed, ridiculed. And for you there's another layer. You're black, and they'll use that to try to erase your brilliance. But hear me now, Malik. Brilliance can't be erased. It shines, even when people try to cover it with dirt." The words sank into him, not erasing the pain, but steadying the ground beneath it. Malik nodded slowly, gripping his notebook tighter. He still hurt, but somewhere beneath the hurt was a flicker of defiance. That night, after Angela had left for her shift, Malik sat at his desk again. The memes still circled in his mind, each one a reminder of how far they were willing to go to silence him. But as he flipped through his notes, he saw something else. The pattern, the proof, the work that had carried him this far. He thought about Whitfield, about Ethan, about the way the school had rewritten his story into arrogance and disruption. If the classroom couldn't see him for what he was, then maybe somewhere else would. He opened his laptop, hands trembling, and searched for opportunities. It didn't take long before he found it. A national high school physics competition. One that invited students to submit original work for review by university professors. The deadline loomed only weeks away. Malik's heart raced. This was a chance, not for the classroom, not for Whitfield, not even for his classmates, but for people who didn't know his name, who would judge only the work. He pulled together his notes, organizing every step, every correction, every explanation of why the equation had been misunderstood. Hours passed as he typed, revised, cross-checked his work. By the time the first traces of dawn touched the sky, the submission was ready. His finger hovered over the submit button. He thought of his father's warning. Even if you're right, they won't want to hear it. He thought of Angela's words. Brilliance can't be erased. He thought of the memes, the laughter, the whispers. And then, with a single breath, he clicked. The screen blinked once, then confirmed. Submission received. Malik leaned back in his chair, exhausted but steady. He didn't tell anyone, not his mother, not his friends, not even himself in the mirror. This was his secret rebellion, a step beyond the walls that tried to contain him. For the first time in weeks, Malik slept with a small smile, knowing that his story wasn't finished, no matter how loudly they tried to end it. Unknown to everyone around him, Malik had entered his proof into a national competition, the very act that would soon drag his private fight into the public eye, setting the stage for a reckoning no one at Westfield High expected. The days following Lake's quiet submission to the competition felt like walking through a storm with no umbrella. The online ridicule hadn't stopped. It grew in waves, each meme sharper, each whisper louder. But now Malik noticed something else. Ethan Parker was watching him more closely. Ethan had always enjoyed the role of Whitfield's golden boy, a student praised for his dedication and promise. His grades were solid but not remarkable. His answers quick but shallow, yet Whitfield lifted him higher with every opportunity. His approval so constant it seemed rehearsed. When Malik had stepped to the board that day, unraveling the impossible equation with precision Ethan could never muster, it cracked the pedestal Ethan had been standing on. Jealousy had a way of festering quietly, but with Ethan it grew into action. He started by planting seeds. In the locker room after gym, he spoke loudly enough for others to hear. Crazy how Malik suddenly had the whole solution, huh? Like he just happened to know what nobody's figured out in decades. Doesn't add up. In the cafeteria, he leaned across tables, whispering with exaggerated certainty. I heard he copied it from some college forum, probably stole it. That's why Whitfield shut him down. The rumors spread easily. They blended with the already toxic narrative, until even students who hadn't witnessed the board incident repeated them as fact. Yeah, Malik cheated, everyone knows. But Ethan wasn't satisfied with whispers alone. He wanted proof to destroy Malik publicly. Late at night, Ethan sat in his bedroom, the glow of his laptop illuminating his determined face. He pulled up textbooks, online articles, and forums, chasing the problem that had slipped through his fingers in class. He scribbled notes furiously, convinced that if he could reconstruct Malik's path, he could prove it was copied. Hours passed. His papers were covered in half-finished equations, arrows crossing out errors, scribbles blotting, failed attempts. No matter how he tried, the solution collapsed under his pen. He grew more frustrated, flipping pages harder, tapping his pencil until it snapped in half. How did he do it? Ethan muttered under his breath. His reflection in the darkened laptop screen stared back with clenched teeth. He's not smarter than me. But the failure gnawed at him, confirming what he couldn't admit out loud. Malik's solution wasn't luck. It wasn't copied. It was brilliance, and brilliance Ethan couldn't match. At school, Whitfield remained Ethan's shield. In class discussions, the teacher praised Ethan's answers no matter how incomplete, brushing past Malik's raised hand or ignoring his input altogether. Excellent point, Ethan, Whitfield would say, even when Ethan's answer skirted the surface. Good thinking, Ethan, he repeated, voice warm with approval. Meanwhile, when Malik spoke, Whitfield's responses were curt. Stay on topic, Malik. That's not the question I asked. The message was unmistakable. Ethan was the star, and Malik was a disruption. The injustice grew heavier with every passing day. In group projects, students chose Ethan without hesitation, leaving Malik isolated. Teachers mentioned Ethan's name in staff meetings, praising his leadership, while Malik's name came attached to discipline concerns. Even the whispers began shifting tone. Ethan's the one who really deserves recognition. Malik's just noise. Malik felt the erasure creeping in, as if the proof he had once written on the board had been erased not just by Whitfield's command, but by the entire school's complicity. The weight pressed on his chest, but at night when he opened his laptop to check his competition submission, he clung to the faint hope that somewhere, outside these walls, his work would speak louder than the lies. The unexpected twist came one gray Wednesday afternoon. Malik sat in the library, headphones in, trying to drown out the buzz of whispers, when his email notification chimed. At first he thought it was just another cruel message, another anonymous taunt, but when he opened his inbox, his breath caught. The subject line read, "Congratulations, physics competition finalist selection." His heart pounded as he clicked. Dear Malik Johnson, we are pleased to inform you that your submission has been reviewed and verified by our panel of judges. Your solution demonstrates originality, depth, and accuracy that sets you apart from thousands of applicants nationwide. You have been selected as a finalist and are invited to present your work at the National High School Physics Forum in Washington, D.C. Malik stared at the screen, his hands trembling. Verified, finalist, thousands of applicants, and his work had risen to the top. The same solution Whitfield had trashed, the same proof Ethan mocked, had now been recognized at the national level. He leaned back in his chair, the noise of the library fading into nothing. For the first time in weeks, he felt air in his lungs again. He hadn't been erased. Not here, not by them. His work was alive, acknowledged, undeniable. But even in that moment of triumph, Malik knew he couldn't share it. Not yet. Not with the school, not with Whitfield, not even with Ethan watching him from the shadows. This victory was his secret, burning like a hidden flame he would guard until it could no longer be denied. Malik closes his laptop slowly, his heart racing. His solution has been verified, and he is a national finalist. But in the halls of Westfield High, no one knows yet, setting the stage for a collision between truth and the lies that surround him. When Malik closed his laptop the night he learned he was a finalist, the screen's glow lingered in his mind like a second heartbeat. For the first time since Whitfield had crumpled his proof, he felt vindication, not in whispers or fleeting glances, but in writing from people who had no reason to doubt him. But the email also carried weight. Being a finalist meant leaving Atlanta, traveling to Washington, D.C., and standing before a panel of judges who would not know his story, only his word. Angela was the first to hear the news. Malik waited until her night shift ended, until the smell of disinfectant still clung to her scrubs, before sliding the printed email across the kitchen table. Angela read it once, then twice. Her tired eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, her exhaustion melted into something brighter. "Baby," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "You did it." "I'm a finalist," Malik said quietly, as if saying it too loud might shatter the truth. Angela's hand found his across the table, her grip firm. "We're going to Washington, Malik. You hear me? We're going to D.C." It would be his first time leaving Georgia. The trip itself felt surreal. Their modest luggage looked out of place against the sleek suitcases rolling across the airport floor. On the plane, Malik stared out the window as the ground fell away, the neighborhoods of Atlanta shrinking into patterns of lights and roads. For a boy who had only ever known cracked sidewalks and borrowed books, the world suddenly seemed bigger than he had ever imagined. Angela sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "This is what they didn't want you to see," she said softly. "That the world is bigger than their classroom, bigger than their limits." When they landed in Washington, the city felt like another planet monument gleaming in the distance, traffic flowing in endless streams, the air thick with both history and ambition. They took a cab to the hotel where the competition was being held, a towering building with glass walls that reflected the sky. Inside, the lobby buzzed with students, their blazers crisp, their voices confident, their parents speaking casually of universities like Harvard and Yale. Malik clutched his notebook tighter, his thrift store sweater suddenly feeling like armor too thin for the battlefield he had stepped onto. Everywhere he looked, he saw privilege. Polished shoes, brand new laptops, fathers with firm handshakes and mothers who carried resumes as casually as shopping lists. One group caught his eye, students from a prestigious prep school in New York, laughing as they compared their practice scores. One of them glanced at Malik, then whispered something that made the others chuckle. He didn't need to hear the words. The glance had been enough. Angela noticed too. She placed her hand on Malik's shoulder. "Don't shrink, baby. You're here because you earned it, not because anyone handed it to you." Malik nodded, though the weight of representing not just himself but his family, his school, and his community pressed harder than ever. The first day was orientation. The judges, a panel of professors and scientists, introduced themselves. They were polite but formal, their eyes scanning the room with quick assessments. When they reached Malik, their nods lingered half a second longer, as if silently asking, "Do you belong here?" That night, Malik lay awake in the hotel bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Whitfield, of Ethan, of the whispers that had chased him down the halls. Tomorrow he would stand before these judges, and for the first time his work, not their doubts, would fill the silence. The morning of his presentation arrived too quickly. The conference room was bright with fluorescent lights, rows of chairs filled with students, parents and judges. Malik sat near the back, his notebook clutched to his chest, watching as competitors presented one by one. Their slides were polished, their voices smooth with rehearsed confidence. Applause followed each, steady and approving. When his name was called, Malik rose slowly. The room felt colder. He walked to the front, his sneakers quiet against the carpet, his thrifted sweater looking plain beside pressed blazers. He set his notes on the podium, his hands trembling just slightly. For a moment the silence was suffocating. Then he began. At first his voice wavered, but as he traced the logic of the equation, confidence seeped back into his words. He explained how the original framing of the problem had carried an overlooked error, how correcting it revealed a path no one had pursued. His steps were methodical, his tone calm but insistent, his chalk strokes on the board clear and deliberate. Something shifted in the room. Parents leaned forward. Students who had smirked earlier now watched closely. Even the judges, their pens poised for skepticism. Pause. Malik's voice grew steadier, each word carrying the weight of the nights he had spent bent over textbooks, the whispers he had endured, the humiliations he had faced. He wasn't just solving an equation, he was reclaiming his name. Angela sat in the back, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes glistening. She mouthed the words silently. "That's my son." By the time Malik reached the conclusion, his fear had evaporated. He laid down the chalk, his board filled with proof not only of the equation, but of his brilliance. And then came silence. Not polite applause. Not immediate praise. Silence. The judges exchanged glances, their brows furrowed. Students shifted in their seats. The air felt heavy, as though the room itself was struggling to process what it had just witnessed. Malik's chest rose and fell, his breath loud in his ears. He looked from face to face, waiting. Was the silence disbelief, admiration, doubt? Angela gripped the edge of her chair, her heart pounding. The silence stretched, and Malik realized the equation wasn't the only thing being judged. Malik stood before the silent room, his solution glowing on the board. The judges frozen, unable, or unwilling to immediately acknowledge the elegance of what he had done. When Malik returned to Atlanta, the memory of the silent room in Washington still lingered. He replayed it over and over, the chalk in his hand, the board filled with proof, the judges exchanging glances, the breathless pause before applause finally broke out hours later in whispered tones and email confirmations. He knew what he had done mattered, that his work had reached a level none of his classmates had dared touch. But back at Westfield High, the air felt unchanged. On Monday morning, Malik walked through the halls, clutching his backpack, his mind buzzing with the knowledge that he was now a national finalist. He expected whispers, questions, maybe even admiration. Instead, he was met with silence. Students glanced at him, but their expressions were blank, as if his trip hadn't happened at all. It wasn't until second period that he realized why. "Did you hear?" a boy muttered behind him. Malik got picked because of diversity quotas. They needed someone, and he fit the bill. "Yeah," another replied. "My cousin said those competitions always do that. Makes them look good picking one kid from the hood." The words stung. Sharper than the mockery had been weeks before. Laughter had hurt, but this, the erasure of his brilliance under the excuse of tokenism, was worse. They weren't denying that he had been chosen. They were denying why. By lunch, the rumor had taken root. Malik walked past tables where students whispered in lowered voices, eyes following him. Ethan sat at the center, his voice louder than the rest, his smile wide. "They just wanted a headline," Ethan said, shrugging with false humility. "I mean, come on. Do you really think Malik solved something no one else could? Be real. It's all politics." His words spread like wildfire, reinforced by Whitfield's silence. The teacher didn't mention Malik's achievement in class, didn't acknowledge the national recognition. Instead, he carried on as if nothing had changed, calling on Ethan more often, praising his half-correct answers, brushing past Malik's raised hand without so much as a glance. In physics, Whitfield introduced a new problem. As Ethan stumbled through a half-explanation, Whitfield nodded approvingly. "Good effort, Ethan. Exactly the kind of thinking I want to see." Malik sat in the second row, his fists clenched under the desk. He knew the answer, knew the pathway, but his voice remained unheard, even when he spoke up. "I think there's a mistake in the second line." Whitfield didn't turn. "Let's move on," the teacher said, eyes fixed anywhere but on Malik. The silence cut deeper than outright ridicule. It wasn't just rejection, it was deliberate erasure. That afternoon, Malik sat in the library, scrolling through his competition email again, rereading the words, "Your solution demonstrates originality, depth, and accuracy. Proof that he wasn't chosen out of pity, but out of merit. Proof that his work had value." But the words on his screen couldn't drown out the ones echoing in the hallways. Angela noticed the change when he came home. He didn't sit at the kitchen table with his notebook. He didn't talk about equations or dreams. He ate in silence, his eyes clouded. "They're saying I only got picked because I'm black," he admitted finally, his voice low. Angela's face hardened, her jaw tightening. "Of course they are. That's how they explain away what they can't control. When you're excellent, they call it luck. When you win, they call it pity. But let me tell you something, Malik. None of them sat in that room with you. None of them saw what you did. The judges didn't hand you anything. You took it." Her words lit a spark, but the weight remained. Malik wanted to believe her, but it was hard when even his teacher, the man who should have been proud, acted as though he didn't exist. The unexpected twist came later that week. Malik was at the library computer, checking for updates from the competition, when he noticed something odd. His email had already been logged in, though he hadn't typed his password yet. Confused, he clicked the sent folder. His stomach dropped. Dozens of messages had been sent from his account, angry, threatening emails directed at teachers, administrators, even other students. Each one signed with his name. One read, "You'll regret underestimating me." Another, "I don't need this school. You'll see when I'm gone." His hands trembled as he scrolled through them, each message a nail driven into a coffin he hadn't built. Panic clawed at his chest. If anyone saw these, it wouldn't matter what he had accomplished. The narrative would write itself: arrogant, aggressive, dangerous. He logged out quickly, his heart racing. Someone had hacked his account. Someone wanted to turn his brilliance into a weapon against him. The question wasn't who. He already knew whose shadow stretched longest over him. Malik sat frozen at the library computer, staring at the evidence of sabotage. His account hacked, his name tied to threats he never wrote. The whispers were no longer enough. Someone was determined to destroy him completely. Malik sat frozen in the library, the glow of the monitor burning his face, his own name stamped beneath words he hadn't written. The sound of distant laughter in the hallway blurred into static. All he could hear was his heart, pounding too loud, too fast. He logged out quickly, but the damage was already done. The emails had been sent. They lived on servers, in inboxes, waiting to be discovered. He stuffed his notebook into his backpack and left the library, his steps unsteady, as if the ground itself had tilted beneath him. The discovery came faster than he expected. The very next morning, Malik was called over the intercom. "Malik Johnson, please report to the principal's office." The whispers began before he even stood. By the time he walked down the hallway, it felt like every pair of eyes followed him. Inside the office, Principal Harris sat stiffly behind his desk, a stack of printed emails laid out like evidence. Whitfield sat beside him, his arms crossed, lips pressed tight in satisfaction. "Mr. Johnson," Harris began, his voice low, "we've received troubling reports. Several emails were sent from your account to staff members, threatening, disrespectful messages. Do you have any explanation for this?" Malik's stomach twisted. "I didn't send those. Someone hacked me. I found out yesterday." Whitfield leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Convenient story, Malik. But why would someone target you, unless you wanted attention? You've been disruptive before." The word landed like a slap. Disruptive. It was the same language, repeated over and over, reducing his brilliance to arrogance, his defiance to danger. "I swear I didn't write them," Malik said, his voice cracking. "You have to believe me." But Harris only sighed as if tired. "Regardless of intent, the messages exist. The competition board has been informed. They'll decide whether your place as a finalist stands." The words hit like a blow to the chest. Malik's chance, the one door he had forced open, the one opportunity to prove himself outside these walls, was already slipping away. When he left the office, his classmates were waiting in the hallway, pretending not to stare. Ethan stood among them, a smirk tugging at his lips. Malik caught the flicker of triumph in his eyes, and for the first time the truth felt unbearable. Someone wanted him erased so badly, they were willing to burn his name to the ground. At home, Malik collapsed onto his bed, burying his face in his pillow. For hours he stayed there, the light shifting outside his window, his body heavy with defeat. What was the point? No matter how brilliant his proof, no matter how elegant his solution, someone would twist it into something ugly. Angela found him that evening, his room still dark. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly on his back. "Baby," she said softly, "talk to me." Malik lifted his head slowly, his eyes red. "What's the point, Mom? They'll never see me for what I am. I solve the problem. They laugh. I prove myself. They call it pity. I fight back. They say I'm a threat. It doesn't matter what I do. It's never enough." Angela's eyes glistened, but her voice stayed steady. "You know it feels that way. I know it hurts. But listen to me. Silence doesn't protect you. It only feeds them. If you stop now, you give them exactly what they want. You think Dr. King didn't face this. You think Baldwin did. They were mocked, erased, threatened, but they kept speaking, because the only way to kill a voice is if it goes quiet." Malik swallowed hard. "But what if I lose everything? Angela cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Then you lose on your terms. Not theirs. You stand tall, Malik. Even if they try to bury you, you stand tall. Because one day, someone will dig up the truth, and when they do, your name will be the one that shines. Her words steadied him, though the weight of fear didn't vanish. That night, Malik opened his notebook again, his pencil trembling in his hand. He worked through the equations once more, not because he doubted them, but because writing them reminded him who he was. Every line was a defiance, every symbol a refusal to be silenced. Days later, an email from the competition board arrived. Malik sat at the kitchen table, Angela standing behind him, both holding their breath. He opened it slowly.
Mr. Johnson.
We are aware of allegations regarding misconduct at your school. After reviewing the evidence, we have found no sufficient grounds to revoke your finalist status. We look forward to your presentation at the National Physics Forum. Relief rushed through Malik like air after drowning, but beneath it fear still lingered, the knowledge that someone would stop at nothing to ruin him. He turned to Angela, her eyes bright with tears. They didn't kick me out, he whispered. Angela kissed his forehead. Of course they didn't, because the truth stands, even when they try to bury it. But Malik knew it wasn't over. His chance remained, but the sabotage had left scars. His reputation at school was fractured, his teacher against him, his classmates ready to believe the worst. Still, the board had given him one more opportunity, and he wasn't going to waste it. On the morning of the competition, Malik stood before the mirror, adjusting his thrift store sweater. His reflection looked older somehow. Less a boy fighting whispers, more a young man carrying the weight of generations on his shoulders. Angela appeared in the doorway, her eyes proud. This is your time, baby. Show them who you are. Malik nodded, his chest tight but steady. He grabbed his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the door. He wasn't walking back into just another stage. He was walking into a battlefield, prepared to give the performance of his life. Malik stepped into the competition hall once again, notebook in hand, determined that this time no whisper, no rumor, no sabotage would silence him. The morning of the final round arrived like the slow drumbeat before a storm. Malik stood backstage, clutching his notebook so tightly that the edges curled under his fingers. Beyond the velvet curtain he could hear the murmur of the crowd, the shuffle of parents, the whispers of students, the quiet hum of cameras preparing to broadcast the competition nationwide. The auditorium felt like an arena. Bright lights glared down on the polished stage, illuminating the long table where the judges sat, their expressions sharp and unreadable. Rows of seats stretched upward in ascending arcs, filled with students in pressed suits and dresses, parents who carried themselves with the confidence of old money, and teachers who leaned forward with anticipation. For Malik, it was more than a competition. It was a trial. Angela sat in the audience, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had chosen her best dress, though it was modest compared to the silks and tailored suits around her. Her eyes never left the curtain. She whispered under her breath, steadying herself as much as her son. You were born for this. Shine, baby. Shine. The announcer's voice boomed. Next, from Westfield High School, in Atlanta, Georgia, Malik Johnson. The sound of his name echoed across the room. Malik inhaled deeply and stepped forward. The lights blinded him at first, but then his vision cleared, and the stage stretched before him. He walked to the podium, his sneakers silent on the polished wood, his thrift store sweater contrasting against the blazers and ties of his competitors. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of every glance, skepticism from judges, curiosity from peers, the quiet hum of doubt from an audience that wondered if he belonged here. He set his notebook down, opened it, and looked up. For a heartbeat, the silence pressed hard, but then his voice came, low at first, then stronger. Good morning. The equation I will be presenting has been considered unsolvable by many, not because it lacks an answer, but because of a misinterpretation at its foundation. My approach begins by correcting that oversight. He turned to the board, picking up the chalk with steady fingers. The scratch of white against black filled the silence as he wrote the first line, and with each line that followed, the tension in the room shifted. Malik moved carefully, methodically, his explanation crisp. He didn't just solve the equation, he unpacked it, showing how each correction led to clarity, how overlooked details revealed pathways that had been hidden in plain sight. His words carried rhythm, the cadence of someone who had rehearsed not just in practice, but in survival. The corrected coefficient allows for balance, he explained, underlining a section. From here, the equation can be applied not only to theoretical problems, but to real-world systems, including orbital mechanics and spacecraft trajectory planning. A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience. Judges who had sat back now leaned forward. One adjusted his glasses, scribbling notes furiously. Angela's hands trembled, but her eyes never left her son. Malik pressed on, connecting abstract math to tangible futures. This adjustment creates efficiency in calculations for satellite launches, reducing error margins significantly. In practice, this could save millions of dollars in aerospace projects. But more importantly, it expands our understanding of how precision at a micro level influences possibilities at the macro. His words hung in the air, carrying weight far beyond the chalkboard. It wasn't just theory, it was vision. And for the first time in weeks, Malik felt the laughter, the whispers, the sabotage melt away. Here, on this stage, there was only the work, his work. He wrote the final line, circled the conclusion, and set the chalk down. His chest rose and fell, sweat glistening faintly under the bright lights. He turned back to the audience, and silence followed. Not the mocking silence of disbelief, but something heavier. Judges exchanged glances, their brows furrowed, not in doubt, but in awe. Parents leaned forward. Students sat still. The weight of his proof hung over the room like a sudden shift in gravity. For one breath, Malik feared it again, that they wouldn't see him, that they would erase it. But then came a sound, soft at first. One pair of hands clapping, then another, and another. The applause grew, swelling into a wave, then breaking into a roar. Parents stood, students rose to their feet. The room erupted into a standing ovation. Angela covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "That's my baby. That's my baby." Malik stood frozen at the podium, the sound washing over him. For the first time, he wasn't mocked. He wasn't silenced. He wasn't erased. He was seen. But as the applause thundered, Malik glanced at the judges. Their faces remained restrained, their clapping polite, measured. Their eyes were sharp, calculating. This wasn't over. The announcer returned to the stage, his voice raised above the cheers. "Thank you, Malik Johnson." Malik stepped back, his notebook pressed to his chest, his legs weak but steady. He returned to his seat, Angela catching his eye from across the room, mouthing the words, "I'm proud of you." The competition continued. Other finalists presented, their work strong, their confidence polished. But the echo of Malik's proof lingered in the room, a current running beneath every subsequent presentation. Finally, the time came for scores. The judges conferred quietly, their whispers lost beneath the low buzz of the audience. Malik's hands tightened around his notebook, his heart pounding with each second. The head judge stood, his voice solemn. "After careful consideration, we are prepared to announce the scores." The room hushed instantly. The judge lifted the first card. "Third place goes to New York Prep." Applause rang out, parents clapping proudly as the student bowed. The second card was raised. "Second place goes to..." The pause stretched, Malik's breath caught. "Malik Johnson, Westfield." The room erupted again in applause, but Malik's ears rang with a hollow sound. "Second place." He forced himself to stand, to walk back to the stage, to accept the silver medal placed around his neck. The audience applauded. Angela's eyes glistened with pride, but deep in his chest, Malik felt the sting. His solution had been flawless, his application groundbreaking. He had been perfect. Yet it wasn't enough. The head judge raised the final card. "And first place goes to..." Malik's chest tightened, the name already forming in his mind, before it left the judge's lap. The head judge's voice echoed across the room, naming the first place winner, not Malik, shattering the moment of triumph into something far more complicated. The name announced for first place echoed across the auditorium, like a verdict. It wasn't Malik's. The applause thundered, parents cheered, and cameras flashed. But Malik stood at the edge of the stage with his silver medal, the weight of it pressing into his chest like lead. Angela clapped fiercely from the audience, her eyes shining with pride. But she could see it, the flicker in her son's expression, the way his jaw clenched. She knew the difference between triumph and injustice. And this was not the world celebrating him. This was the world pulling him back down, even as he soared. Malik smiled faintly as the cameras turned toward him, but inside his heart was heavy. He had been flawless. He knew it. He had shown his proof, connected it to real-world applications, and received a standing ovation. Yet somehow, it hadn't been enough. After the ceremony, the auditorium buzzed with chatter. Students congratulated each other. Parents networked, and judges mingled. Malik stood with Angela near the back, trying to hold his head high. "You were incredible," Angela whispered, squeezing his shoulder. "Don't let them take that from you." But Malik's eyes lingered on the judge's table, where they shuffled papers and whispered. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been decided long before he touched the chalk. Behind the curtain, away from the crowd, the truth unfolded. Two judges lingered near the side entrance, speaking in low voices. "You know as well as I do, Johnson should have taken first," one said, his tone edged with frustration. The proof was airtight. The application was visionary. Nobody else came close. The other judge glanced around nervously. "I agree. But we were under pressure." The board member from Westfield, Ethan Parker's father, called before the competition. He made it clear that if Johnson was given first place, there would be consequences. The first judge frowned. "You mean funding cuts?" "Exactly. The sponsorship from the state board, the annual grants, the media support. It was all on the line. They told us second place was the safest option." The words hung in the air, heavy with corruption. Malik hadn't just been competing against equations. He had been competing against a system designed to hold him back. A system where power bent truth into convenience. Unbeknownst to them, a young journalist covering the event had paused near the doorway, notebook in hand. She had been following the finalists all week, hoping for a story of brilliance and perseverance. Now she had stumbled onto something much darker. Her pen hovered as she listened. A school board member interfering? Manipulating scores? She scribbled furiously, her eyes wide. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Ethan basked in the glow of his father's influence. Though he hadn't competed, his connection to the board whispered through the crowd. Parents congratulated him as if he had played a part, their smiles knowing, their words thinly veiled. "Your father must be proud," one parent said. Ethan smirked. "He always is." Malik noticed from across the room, his chest tightening. He understood now, this wasn't about equations or merit. It was about power, about hands pulling strings behind curtains. Angela saw the storm in her son's eyes. She leaned in, her voice steady but fierce. "Listen to me, Malik. They can steal medals. They can twist scores, but they can't touch what you've already done. You solved it. You proved it. That proof is yours, and no one can erase it." Malik nodded faintly. But the sting was deep. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was systemic. A father on the school board, a teacher complicit in silence, a son shielded by privilege. Every door Malik pushed open, another hand slammed shut in his face. As the crowd thinned and families left with their medals, Malik lingered by the stage, staring at the chalkboard still covered in his equations. He traced the lines with his eyes, committing them to memory. No medal, no ranking, could change what he had written. But behind him, the young journalist scribbled one final note. Her heart racing. She had heard enough to know this was bigger than a competition. This was a story, and stories had the power to shake walls. The journalist slipped out quietly, clutching her notebook, ready to expose the hidden hand that had stolen Malik's victory. The auditorium emptied, but the echoes lingered. Malik walked beside Angela, his silver medal pressed against his chest like a reminder of everything he'd given, and everything taken from him. The ovation still lived in his ears, yet it was dulled by the final sting. Flawless work, and still not enough. But Malik didn't know that his story was already leaving the room, carried not by whispers this time, but by ink. The young journalist who had overheard the judge's conversation spent the night in her hotel room typing furiously. Her notes became paragraphs, her paragraphs sharpened into a headline that glowed across her laptop screen. The boy who solved the impossible equation, and the system that tried to silence him. The piece opened with Malik's story, his background, his brilliance, the standing ovation that erupted at his presentation. But then it revealed the hidden hand, the pressure from Ethan Parker's father, the corruption behind the rankings, the systemic bias that had buried Malik's victory under politics. By morning, the article had been picked up by a major outlet. By afternoon, it was everywhere. On Twitter, hashtags surged. Ian Malik was first. Ian boy genius. Exposed. Screenshots of Malik at the chalkboard flooded timelines, side by side with quotes from the article. He was flawless. He deserved first place. But power decided otherwise. On Instagram, clips of Malik's presentation spread. Someone had recorded part of it, his steady voice explaining how physics applied to space engineering. The caption read, "This young man should be celebrated, not silenced." Within hours, social media turned in his favor. Thousands of strangers championed him, their outrage mixing with awe. "This is what racism looks like in 2025. One post read, "Brilliance denied, but not erased." Another, "Malik Johnson is the real winner." At school, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Students who had mocked him now scrolled through their phones in stunned silence, seeing his name plastered across national headlines. Even those who had whispered, "Quota," now watched as universities tweeted support. Angela sat at the kitchen table that evening, scrolling through her phone with tears in her eyes. "Baby," she whispered, showing Malik the screen. "Harvard, MIT, Stanford. They're all reaching out. Full scholarships. They're calling you a genius." Malik stared at the emails flooding his inbox. Offers, invitations, interviews. The same name that had been mocked in memes was now trending on every platform. Yet even in the whirlwind of support, Malik's chest carried a quiet ache. "Why did it take the whole world to see me before my own teacher did?" he asked softly. Angela cupped his face in her hands. "Because sometimes the people closest to you are the most blinded by their own prejudice. But look at you now, Malik. They couldn't keep you hidden. The world knows your name." The twist came when Malik checked his phone again. Among the scholarship offers was another email. Different, heavier. "We would like to formally invite Malik Johnson to be a featured speaker at the National Science Forum. Televised nationwide. This year's theme, Breaking Barriers in STEM." His hands trembled as he read it aloud. Angela gasped, her eyes wide. "They want you to speak on television." Malik's breath caught. A televised forum. A national stage. Bigger than the competition. Bigger than any classroom. But as he read the email further, his chest tightened. The list of attendees included educators from across the country, including Westfield High, and among them scheduled to represent the district were Mr. Whitfield and Ethan Parker. Angela's eyes narrowed as she saw the names. "They'll have to watch you shine," she said fiercely. "They'll have no choice." But Malik felt the familiar weight again. The burden of standing not just for himself, but for every doubt, every whisper, every humiliation. The world had lifted him up, but the very people who had tried to silence him would be in the room, watching, waiting. He closed the laptop slowly, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The boy who had once been mocked as a janitor now stood on the edge of a stage bigger than any he had imagined. Malik sat in the quiet of his room, staring at the invitation, knowing his next speech would not only be for the world, but for the very faces that had once tried to erase him. The day Malik returned to Westfield High felt like walking into the eye of a storm that had finally passed. His name was no longer whispered in hallways, but printed in headlines, spoken on television, shared across timelines. He was no longer the boy mocked for raising his hand. He was the finalist, the genius who had stood on a national stage and made the world listen. But as he walked through the doors of the same school where it all began, the air felt heavy with something unspoken. Students turned as he passed, their gazes different now, not mocking, not dismissive, but wide with something that looked like awe, and maybe guilt. Angela walked beside him, her chin lifted high. She hadn't dressed in scrubs today. Instead, she wore her Sunday best, as if she knew this was more than a school assembly. This was history. The auditorium buzzed with voices as the school gathered, packed tighter than for any pep rally or football send-off. At the front of the room, the principal stood stiffly at the podium. Mr. Whitfield sat a few rows back, his expression unreadable. Ethan slouched beside him, eyes fixed on the floor. The principal cleared his throat. "Today we recognize a student who has brought honor not only to Westfield High, but to this district and to the state of Georgia. Malik Johnson, finalist at the National Physics Forum, whose work has already been hailed as groundbreaking." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling as students, teachers, and parents joined in. Malik stood from his seat and walked slowly toward the stage. Every step carried the weight of memory, every whisper, every smirk, every time he had been dismissed. And yet each step also felt lighter now, as if he were walking not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. When he reached the podium, The room fell into silence. He glanced toward the second row, where the chalkboard loomed behind him, still bearing faint white streaks from the equations of the week before. The same board where his proof had been cut short. Malik rested his notebook on the podium, but he didn't open it. His voice came steady, quiet at first, then stronger. "Some of you remember the day I stood at this board," he began. "You remember the laughter, the whispers. You remember when I was told I had gone far enough." The room stirred. Students shifted in their seats, some avoiding his gaze. "I carried that moment with me," Malik continued. "I carried it through nights of study, through the competition, through every headline that called me a genius or a fraud. And I came back to the same truth. None of it started on a stage. It started here, in this room, on this board." He turned, picked up the chalk and traced the outline of the same problem. The symbols sprawled across the board like ghosts of the past. For a moment, the silence was so thick it felt like no one dared breathe. Malik set the chalk down gently and faced the room again. "I didn't come here to gloat. I didn't come here to say I told you so. I came here to remind you that brilliance doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't fit into quotas. It doesn't wait for approval. Brilliance simply is." His voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. "When I solved this, people told me I cheated. They told me I was arrogant. They told me to stay in my place. And maybe some of you believed it. But the truth is, the only place I belong is wherever my mind can reach. And that's true for all of us." Angela wiped her eyes in the back row. Malik lifted his hand toward the board. "This equation isn't a wall. It isn't a reminder of what we can't do. It's a door. And I want every one of you to remember this. Never let anyone tell you what you can't solve." The words hung in the air like lightning, charging the silence until it finally broke. Not with laughter this time, but with applause. Loud, thunderous applause that rolled through the auditorium, shaking the very walls that had once felt like a cage. Students stood, teachers clapped. Even those who had whispered "quota" found themselves swept up in the force of his words. But Whitfield remained seated, his hands still, his jaw tight. Ethan slumped further into his chair, his face pale, his father's influence suddenly powerless in the face of Malik's truth. Malik stepped back from the podium, his chest rising and falling. He wasn't smiling, not broadly, not triumphantly. His expression was calm, resolute, as if he knew this was not an ending, but a beginning. The chalkboard behind him, once a symbol of humiliation, now glowed under the stage lights. The equation transformed into something greater. Not failure, not silence, possibility. The auditorium buzzed with energy, but Malik's gaze was far away. He wasn't thinking about medals or scores anymore. He was thinking about the kids who would come after him, who would stand at their own boards, who would face their own laughter and whispers. He was thinking of the ones who might hear his words and decide not to stop, not to shrink, not to believe the lie that brilliance had boundaries. He stepped down from the stage, his mother's arms waiting to embrace him, the room still echoing with applause. But as the noise swelled, a question lingered in the air, a question no medal or article could answer. A question meant not just for Malik, but for everyone watching, everyone listening, everyone who had ever been told to stay in their place. If you were in Malik's shoes, would you have kept fighting or walked away? Stories like Malik's remind us that silence protects no one, and courage changes everything. If you believe brilliance deserves recognition, type yes in the comments. And if this broke your heart, subscribe because more voices like his need to be heard.